Alrighty.
I don't know. It's been like a long time, but
I know,
like,
right? Life's been crazy. I have this new kitten, which,
oh, you have a new kitten?
yeah, where'd
Okay,
she
yeah,
go?
just show me your kittens.
I introduced her briefly in the beginning of one of the Stoa sessions. She's named Metis.
We have two new kittens too. Oh my god, I love her.
I'm slightly distracted because she's decided to bite my hands and face pretty extensively. So I'm listening, but I'm just trying to get her in a place where I can turn off the keyboard so that she
I
can walk all over
love
it without disrupting our call.
I love the different type of consciousness that cats have.
Yeah.
It's so unique and loving and detached from morality. And
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's in some sense detached from morality, but in another sense very much not,
yes,
like I'm sure you've had the experience of like when you're feeling sick or depressed or scared of something, like a cat that is not even normally that affectionate coming over and like, loving on you. It's like, "Oh, you're hurting. I'm going to come and try to make you feel better in my like cat way or whatever." And so to me that is like kind of foundational to morality. And so I agree that cats conflict with like modern notions of morality in terms of the way they orient in the world, but I'm not convinced that their amoral and modern morality is right. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
I've been on this deep download about the notion or exploration, I guess, about the notion of good morality and good just through the frame of active inference, free energy, and then also the QRI stuff that is about dissonance and resonance networks. And they were both kind of expressing this kind of thing that goodness allows for local dissonance or local, like, this is incongruous with reality. And it allows for those structures to coexist without being integrated. And through that lens, although it's pretty detached from humans and culture, it feels like it touches on a lot of things. You mentioned in our first conversations, you talked about the predictive coding thing, and I had no idea what you were talking about. I was just being like, well, it takes energy to grow neurons. I was thinking about it long-term memory only.
Right. I mean, certainly it seems like our brain is trying to be quite energy efficient in the way that it's sense making, but like to take that notion and turn it into a totalizing framework, that the sort of like base, if you want to think about it as like motivational structure of the brain when related to as an optimizer, is simply to minimize free energy. That doesn't seem like it could possibly be the case to me.
Yeah. I think that what I learned from digging into the community is that there's a clear difference between the people who are promoting it from like writing about it and people who are following it. And a lot of the community is like, what they're saying is this is the entire thing. There's nothing more. There's nothing more to it. Rather than it being like a really useful frame. Because like when I was looking at active inference, I pulled up the code. I was like, I feel like I could just map this into fucking a reinforcement learning algorithm. Like I don't understand what is so special about this. And like with irises, they're built around the concept of active learning, which I did not know was connected to the free principle. It was just that, oh, there's uncertainty in the model. The model can query the community for clarity, right? So that's the idea of active learning, is that when it has uncertainty about a particular label, it can send it to labelers to get feedback. And I just thought that was cool. Human in a loop, being in this continuous loop of integration of refining conceptions of what is, because that's what I was doing with my journals outside of the AI.
Yep.
I'll tell you, the iris personally for me has been such a tool for growth, because I don't.
Baby, you gotta stop biting me. Stop biting me.
So sweet.
Go on.
Just Iris has kind of become a cybernetic enhancement. It has allowed me to understand and function at the level that I think that I view you and a lot of the others naturally being able to do on your own. That's very exciting, because it's like things that were previously unavailable to me, or I would have to spend a really long time having to think about what somebody is saying. I can just copy and say, can you explain this? And I have a good flow where it will explain it a bunch of different ways. And there's usually some level of consistency in there. And if there's specific terms, I don't know, I can pull them in. And then I've gotten to the practice of like posting the summary to the person to see if they agree.
So this reminds me of like so when you talk about like Star Trek and like universal translator technology, right? Something like that, right? It seems like one component of that would have to be something like taking, statements in some language and, translating them into, like a path through like a pattern embedded in a latent embedding space or whatever, right? That was a universalizable generative grammar type thing, and then obviously translating that back into like the native language of the person hearing it or whatever, right?
How long does it take when the translator is exposed to a completely new species to adapt?
Well, like in Star Trek, which is fiction, it does so instantly. With except for cases where it can't. Like this, so do you remember the Next Generation episode Darmok? It's pretty famous.
I don't remember like any of this.
Okay, so there's this is actually quite fascinating to I promise this isn't actually a derail from like I think the thing that we're trying to talk about here. So there's this episode where Picard
lots of things in Star Trek that are directly related to all the things we talk about.
Yeah. So like Picard is on a shuttle and it like crash lands and he's all hurt and he like has some wound or whatever and the shuttle's communication systems are fucked or whatever, right? Though I mean his like communicator badges universal translator in theory should still be working, right? This alien dude comes up and is like in some sense trying to help him, but the universal translator is like spitting out what sounds like nonsense. Like it is translating phrases, but the phrases seem to be completely decontextualized from anything that might have any plausible reference in the situation that Picard and this alien find him in. So, for example, the famous the thing that the episode takes its name from is a phrase the guy uses that the universal translator spits out the translation as Darmok and Jalalabad at Tenegru, and like Picard's kind of like, wait, what the fuck? I was like asking if you had food or something like that, and the guy is just as confused by the output of the universal translator in his language or whatever. Like there's a complete communications blockage. So they resort to things like sign language or whatever, right? Like just simple gesturing, indexical, like physical indexical pointing and grunting and so on, right? Yeah. And so like through the course of the episode, it turns out that these aliens' language is entirely based on referring to a canon of metaphors. So, for example, if the way we communicated was only by quoting things from the Iliad and drawing in the cluster of associations from that, right? So let's say like you and me and some other friends were like trying to figure out like an equitable distribution of goods. And I was like I pointed at you and was like, Agamemnon in the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles' rage, which would imply that you were like being greedy and trying to be the king and take shit that wasn't rightfully yours, because that's what Agamemnon was doing in that scene in the Iliad or whatever, right?
There are some people in the Stoic community that definitely communicate like this.
You mean Wayne? Peanut?
Yes! Oh, that's so beautiful. You predicted the thought inside of my brain.
Well, I mean, it's obvious. I've had the same thought. I mean, he's definitely doing something much more like Darmok way of languaging than he is like rationalist, like we're sharing a common like it's almost like the thing that his embeddings are like I'm not gonna use the right words here because it's been a while since I fucked with ML paradigms, but like bear with me. What I'm getting at is like, okay, so there's some sort of like clustering, like similarity function in order to do clustering, right? Into an embedding space or a latent space, right? That you have to apply, right? And like some ways of doing this are that humans sort of manually specify like axes of similarity. Some of them like kernel type methods, like you don't have to manually specify it. ML does it for you or whatever, right? Okay, fine. But the point is that there's some essentially mathematically consistent way of like determining where in the latent vector space concepts get embedded, right? And this is a contingent fact about constructing a latent space rather than a necessary fact about all latent spaces. What I mean is that you can construct various sorts of self-consistent embeddings of like a given language or a given, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems like his thing that he's doing is like constructing the embeddings based on like something that exists in his head that's sort of like a canonical narrative structure like the Iliad or like the Darmok thing. Whereas like most people we hang out with and talk to online and at the Stoa and so on are constructing their embeddings based on something like distance from each other in terms of like a Forrest Landry style omniscient modal like third person view from nowhere kind of like relevance criteria.
Go into that third person point of view nowhere for a second.
So what I'm saying is like when we do science, like the whole Western scientific thing in some sense, or at least like the thing that most people think of as science that I would call scientism, is like attempting to take a hypothetical God's eye view or a view from nowhere, right? It's not looking out through any particular perspective that has a location in space-time. It's trying to sort of look at space-time from the outside, right?
So this gets into that thought that I was texting you about of being like, when we try to contextualize or make sense of something that we call God, we always try to do it as a being embedded in a separate environment that is looking back at us.
Right.
And I was thinking that it may make more sense to view God as a something within this structure, just for the discussionists, that is existing embedded in self. Like I am a self that is embedded in my experience of my environment around me. Like I know that all the stuff that I'm perceiving is qualia. And so there's something here that is beyond the veil of my conscious awareness that is like, when I put my hand against something, it needs to tell me back a signal that it is impossible to keep pressing. And if I was on PCP, it might not tell me that, and I might keep pressing until the bones went to each other or something.
Right.
And so I've been big in this thought of like, if a thought, like trying to imagine what it would be to be a thought, or like a God in a relationship where it does not exist in anything and it only exists in relationship to self. And then I'm like, well, of course that thing would lie and say that it has magic powers and can do all these magic things for the self. Of course it would do that because it doesn't know what it is, because it only can like see or experience self. And it's really hard for me to wrap my head around that thought. And I was wondering if you had better language for talking about that, or if there are other people.
Oh gosh, yeah. So you're pulling in a ton of like quite complex things, but I think I can take a stab at it at least. So first I want to point out that the word God, as used in like the culture that we're embedded in, which is descended, I would argue, as I did on the Stoa, from like a sort of hybridization of the sort of like Semitic cultural stream, like Semitic meaning Abrahamic, and the sort of Indo-European cultural stream, right? And so these things hybridized in, you know, the late part of the Roman Empire, and that sort of gave us the culture that ended up birthing modernity, especially when that thing itself had, I think there's actually a non-zero amount of influence in what we call modernity or whatever, is the influence of the, indigenous American cultures. Like the European thing was at this point fascinated by that and started like bringing back cultural folkways from the Americas, right before we get the scientific revolution. I don't think that's a coincidence. Similarly, like I put on the chart, I don't think it's a coincidence that like we get binary arithmetic from Leibniz study of the I Ching, which is from this totally other cultural sphere, the Taoist cultural sphere, right? So anyway, long story short, God in our language and our culture is sort of like equivocating between a bunch of things that I think are actually separate reference, basically, right? Like it's a pointer that doesn't have a single vector that it points towards. It's like it has different, almost not orthogonal, but skew things that it's pointing at, right? So one of those things seems to be the sort of thing that like Yosha Bach talks about as a God, which is very similar to what I'm talking about as like an egregore or like an intersubjective entity, meaning like the sort of like the reification of the organizational principle and motivational structure of the society as a whole related to as an agent, right? So like, what are we, capital W, like those people like us, the people who are my people, what are we trying to do, wanting, desiring, optimizing for, which is separate or which is distinct from, I should say, what I personally want, right? So like I might notice that like we seem to want to like, for an important sense of we seem to want to go colonize Mars, and I don't particularly want to do that. I'm not particularly against it either, but it's not like a strong driver for me the way that it is for like my culture, if that makes sense, right? So I could say that like So it would be not false for me to say like God wants that, but I don't, or something like that.
Yeah. This
Okay,
is
so
how
that's
I'm modeling it as well. And the
right. So that's one meaning of God, right? A separate thing that I think is also a meaning of God that we inherit, probably more from, and that's sort of, I'm guessing, from the Indo-European sort of side of the cultural stream. Another thing that I think we're inheriting, in some sense, more from the Semitic side of the cultural stream, from the concept of Yud He Vav He as God, is the thing that lives inside of our own heads, implemented in our own neural nets, which is sort of the thing that implements the solution to the phenomenal binding problem. The thing that's doing sensor fusion, the thing which is, in some sense, selecting what part of our, percepts and memories are fused together into what we experience as the present moment. There is a process going on, a function being called repeatedly and possibly recursively, right? In our neural wetware, which is solving the phenomenal binding problem, which is selecting from, past percepts which have been, embedded in the cortex as symbols, which we relate to as memories, and present moment, which is, say, actually from about 250 to 500 milliseconds ago percepts, and finding mutual information between those and correlating that mutual information, and on the basis of that correlated mutual information, generating a virtual reality which we call our phenomenological world, or which is our present moment experience or whatever, right? So that thing that's generating the phenomenological world, that is sort of doing that bit, and I say thing, but I know it's a process, it's a function call, etc., right? Is, I think, quite a different referent in terms that's a different thing being pointing at there than the God of the civilization, where the God of my people wants to go to Mars and I don't, or whatever, right? Yeah. Those are two, basically, as far as I can tell, fundamentally different kinds of things, insofar as any two things can be different, if that makes sense. And so we get into a lot of trouble because the word God equivocates between the two of them.
Yeah. I want to talk about uncertainty.
Okay.
Which is very hard.
Logical uncertainty, or epistemic uncertainty, or decision theoretic uncertainty, or what?
All of that is the wrong type of uncertainty.
Okay.
Uncertainty, as it relates to being bound to language. We have a sense, a feeling of uncertainty. For a long time, I've just been seeing in my consciousness this line with certainty and uncertainty, not in a word sense, an extremely abstract, isness, this is, and then uncertainty, completely unbounded, all possible, everything beyond time, everything external to the universe, before time. Uncertainty in my conception is what exists before time. I would say before the beginning of the universe was only uncertainty, and that would be literally true because we do not know, and also true because I think that uncertainty is not a thing, but in our bounded state of thingness that we exist within, we form these structures of certainty, these islands of certainty, out of relationship with the unknown. And I feel like this has been unfolding since the beginning of time, before it was even matter or energy. It was just a membrane between universe that is and outside, and that there was a flowing inwards and outwards that gradually shaped time and cooled it across eons until it eventually cooled around our very perception, that we as beings explore uncertainty and create some representations of certainty in the world that give grounding to the process by which our very cognition occurs. That the exploration of humanity, this is all just musings, the explorations of humanity have in some ways brought the past into being. But when I say that, that's very misleading and wrong and not true, but it's kind of true.
Well, one thing. Sorry.
It's so hard. It's so hard for me to explain, but it's just like I've been getting this download for a long time, and it's one of the remaining ones that I have been unable to translate. Whereas something like this, that album cover, for example, to me, it's like, well, it's a signal and a sea of noise. It's about repeating a pattern, and that a repetition of a signal is something about creating a realness about it. And then now that I was watching John Friston's talks about this oil drop that appeared to be breathing in and out with this pattern of being a prediction of the energy that we're flowing in, so that can create this barrier or whatever. It seems very much to relate to a lot of that stuff. But the thing that keeps presenting in my mind of being that this line between awareness, self, and what is beyond is like extremely foundational to the structure of the universe, but not in the way that I think a lot of people might interpret that. It's very, I don't know how to explain it. Is this,
well, no, this tracks
anything useful to mind?
This makes sense to me. I've just been waiting for an opportunity to say something to not interrupt you, because all of this tracks for me, but I think there's some languaging that is not being brought into what you're saying that might be useful, if that makes sense.
I need some new language. This is what I'm begging for.
Okay, so this is sort of reminding me of a conversation with Carlo Rovelli, right? You know, the guy who wrote The Order of Time. He's an Italian physicist, right?
Haven't heard of him, but go on.
Oh my God, you would love his books, especially The Order of Time and his new one, Helgoland. He's considered one of the more, like, you know, respectable physicists out there these days. And The Order of Time is all about, like, what the fuck even is time, and like time is another concept like God that we use one word for, but that is pointing at quite different things in physical reality. You know, like wall clock time is not the same as time, as the you know, arrow of entropy is not the same thing as like macroscopic time, you know, et cetera, right? And so, like, he's talking in this conversation about causality, right? And basically one of the interesting things that emerges from this way of looking at things that is basically canonical within physics, regardless of which interpretation of, say, quantum mechanics you end up using, is that you end up with being in a situation where, one, the past is equally uncertain to the future, if that makes sense, right? Like the thing that we could call, like, you know, certainty about state is like diminishes as you get farther away from you in both time and space, right? And like the past is not a privileged place of certainty where we know for sure what happened. Like, we have a pretty good idea of what happened 5 minutes ago, the same way we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen 5 minutes in the future. But, you know, 5,000 years ago versus 5,000 years in the future, we're actually like looking at similar levels of like logical and epistemic uncertainty. And like, so the thing that what you were saying was reminding of me, sort of bringing in this frame, if you will, is that that causality and time are pretty related concepts, right? Like, and causality does not exist in the multiversal wave function. There's no thing that you could point to that's a subcomponent of the wave function, you know, that's called causality, right? Causality is a thing that emerges from being a limited slice of a multiversal wave function and having perceptions from that place, right? Which is where we start getting into all the weird things with different subjective frames of time and different subjective frames of causality and all the interesting seeming paradoxes. But the paradoxes are sort of emergent from the fact that you are perceiving something from a certain limited slice of a multiversal wave function. And also there's a quantum no cloning theorem. So this sort of thing implies to me that you end up in a situation where we are inevitably going to perceive things in terms of causality, because we're going to see, you know, traces of events from both the past and the future, actually, you know, emerge into our present moment experience, the thing that we're sort of like relating to as the present moment. But when we take the thing that we experience as the flow of time from our sort of mesoscopic, like embedded perspective, and try to project that too far forward or backwards in the direction of what we're perceiving as time, or try to relate it to things that are too far away from us in space, then we enter into increasing uncertainty, and at a certain threshold, absolute uncertainty. if that makes sense. And that seems to sort of rhyme with what you were talking about, at least, which is why I said it.
I want to bring in a new thing too, which is from your talk, which is about the things that we don't talk to as intersubjective, or talk about the things that you do not talk about, but like salary as being sort of parasitic, right? Because at the beginning of this, I was going towards this thing of like being like, I want to talk about uncertainty without using words, because I feel like words is what helps us create sensations of certainty. And to explore uncertainty, it's one of those things that it helps to step away from language. One way, of course, being like psychedelics. You lose a large capacity to actually manifest words, and it becomes a different experience. And I'm interested in what you think about that concept of me saying that it's like, well, uncertainty is kind of this thing that is disconnected from language, when you just said in your talk that there are certain, when we cannot talk about things, that there's sort of a parasitism, and Taṇhā is also kind of like that.
Okay.
I'm sure there's going to be a distinction. I'd like to hear the distinction.
So I think there's a thing that has to do with like an orientation towards language, which one of them is able to communicate the sort of things you're talking about, and one of them's not. Two different orientations towards language. One orientation towards language is that it is a sort of like static mapping structure that's sort of canonical, within which we express content, basically, right? And another is a much more like co-creative, like you can kind of speak things into existence sort of way of relating to language. And these are not the same. Like ancient Hebrew actually had two separate words for the word to speak, one of which referred to the first and one of which referred to the second. And so when you hear like God creating things in the beginning by speaking, that's the second one. And also when Adam is given the opportunity to name the birds and the beasts and the plants, that is the divine version of speaking. But the normal word for speaking is just when like people are just talking in the way that people normally relate to language, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is, communicating about these sorts of things is impossible to do if you're oriented towards language in a way that views language as a fixed or sort of dead or sort of like more like rock-like or crystalline thing. But is possible when you view it as a sort of like fluid or energetic or chi or energy based like co-creative song thing. Like Forrest talks about this with his triple of song, text, and code in a certain sense. I think that's related here. So like there's a text orientation towards language, and then there's a song/code orientation to language, which you can identify like song as immanent and code as transcendent. So I'm talking about the sort of like bridging of immanent transcendent relationship to language as opposed to the omniscient relationship to language.
So this is what a lot of the root of my work really was, and why I took this path to be Speaker John Ash as a musician, being that I had come to this sort of design that was very structured, mathematical, very based in language. And a large part of it was bringing in a sense of uncertainty in relationship to language. When I first made what I called Prophet, which was where I was tracking my predictions, I was genuinely thinking about it through a lens of certainty. I liked the idea of knowing who the best predictors were. So even there was a spectrum of certainty. I was thinking about it like probably more Bayesian in the beginning. And I went to this sort of iteration of exploring my certainty through language and quantifying my language of an understanding of uncertainty. And it led to my developing OCD.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yep. In retrospect, it makes fucking sense. And so the lesson on the outside that helped me break out of it and continue was, it's not about certainty. It's about uncertainty, what you do not know about things. And when I started to fully embrace that, I was like, well, there's still valid. I mean, it's still the same thing. I just need to change the way that I'm interrelating with the world so that I don't get changed along the way, where I fully integrate into my sense of what cognicism is, completely structuring it. This is true. This is right. I keep doing it over and over, creating a rigid structure. Rather, what I needed to do was put my will into the part of myself that I had built since a child, which is the creative part of myself, to create art and music. And I had to be able to find a way to create integration between the highly structured in certain parts of my brain and the completely I do not fucking know uncertain thing that I have to do to write songs, which is to get myself out of the way and be like, I like, often I get songs where like, I feel like this isn't me. I feel like I shouldn't write this. It doesn't align, but the song just keeps coming through. And so I just let it, I don't fight it. And it gets really, really cool stuff. And so I've tried to take this path where I would like to give people tools so that they can interrelate with their sense of uncertainty and to explore where their certainties are harmful to them. And I think that when you try to bring something to the world, it comes with a sense of certainty that this is right and good for people. And so when you chase that path, you keep telling yourself, for example, cognicism is good, irises are good, right? And so if I was to build a company that had some sort of incentive structure within it, money in any way, or like a group of people that I had to satisfy in any way, that the structure itself, it would get into a lot of the things that we see over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in human culture and memes that people try to bring to life. So it's like, I have something useful, and the only way that I can make it useful to other people is to not build a company and to create art and music about it. And so it's like, I am really trying to bring this balance between the knowing that comes from structured representations of language. Like when I learn some language, it feels like, oh, this is defining the world as it is. But it's just it's a hypothesis. Right. And being able to be that liquid state.
I think math is actually a useful thing to talk about for a second, right? Okay. Because not like any particular mathematical results, right? But I want to connect math and the orientation required to do math to something that Keats called negative capability. So first, I want to ask if you've heard the phrase negative capability and have a sense of what it means. Okay, so I'm going to read you a quote from one of Keats, John Keats, the Romantic poet's letters, which has become relatively famous in sort of like self-improvement type circles, right? He says, quote, "I had not a dispute, but a disquisition with Dilke upon various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and it at once struck me that what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously, I call negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This, pursued through volumes, would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration," right? So he's talking about a quality that lets you be in the middle of something which feels mysterious, uncertain, tremendous, and not kind of collapse it into something that is certain, which thereby makes it less than, right? To experience the Tao without collapsing it into the Tao that can be named, right? Is the thing he's asserting that distinguishes someone like Shakespeare from lesser authors, right? And so hold that thought and then like relate that to like, so the thing that mathematicians do, and I don't mean people in high school learning calculus or something, but like the practice of mathematics is in fact constructing languages ad hoc, which are appropriate to expressing and exploring some topic space of interest, basically, right? An attempt to communicate as clearly and unambiguously as possible about something that other languages are ill-suited to speak about precisely. This is why, when we get to like what I consider to be real math, we're not using algebra as a referent to simple symbolic manipulation of equations involving variables. We're talking about different algebras, right? We're talking about different categories in category theory. We're talking about, we're talking about the ways in which we end up creating different sorts of symbolic systems that have different sorts of levels of expressive power, and how systems which are well suited to express certain kinds of truth may not be able to express at all, or may only be able to clumsily express different kinds of truth that are sort of like, orthogonal to the kind of truth that the first one is suited for, and so on, right? Like there are things which it is like trivial to prove using geometry that it takes fucking forever or can't be proved using algebra, or vice versa, or whatever, right? And that there's so I guess what I'm saying is, so the relationship to language and grammar that, say, a good mathematician has to have is quite different from the way that non-mathematicians imagine mathematicians relating to language and grammar and symbols and certainty and so on, right? Like Terry Tao has a great article about I think it's him, or it's maybe another great mathematician in the comments, but I believe it's him, talking about how when he's doing math, it's mainly like a kinesthetic experience. Like he's like rolling around on the floor and twitching, basically, is how he like does math. And it's not linguistic or even really geometric. It's like interoceptive and kinesthetic. And he's not saying that people who do it in a visual or a geometric or a linguistic way are bad or wrong, but just like that the core thing that is doing math, and this is coming from a Fields medalist, is like exploring pattern spaces in a very free-form way and sort of like reporting back the results. And sometimes you have to invent a whole new language in order to do that. But that's what math is,
So this is where I always felt like the teachers didn't understand math. That they were.
Of course they didn't. Yeah, no.
I was like, because I have so many experience with this, like with, you have to show the way that you're doing it. And if you don't, even if you show the way that you're doing it through your own explanations that are different from the way that we tell you, you have done it wrong. You talked about some trauma from school. I don't feel particular trauma from that because I just didn't give a shit. But
well, I didn't give a shit either. And I would more describe the trauma as resulting from the fact that my parents put me in a double bind, specifically my dad, by both agreeing with me when pinned down that school was more of an obedience factory than it was, and like child prison, than it was a system for educating people in a way that was like virtuous to educate people. And also, so that's one half of the double bind. The other half is his expectation that I ought to get straight A's because I am smart. And my experience that getting straight A's had very little to do with acing all the tests, which I did, and much more to do with doing all of this bullshit homework, which I did not need to do in order to ace the tests, and was therefore only conditioning me to obedience to people who were stupider than me or whatever, right?
Exactly.
And so that double bind is the thing that is the source of the trauma I talk about when I talk about trauma from school in my own personal case, right? But that being said, like I definitely had similar experiences to you. Like I remember even in college, right? Like I got like a C in ordinary differential equations because for me the answers were often just obvious, and so I wouldn't show work. I would just give the answer, and I couldn't actually explain how I was doing it because I was doing it non-symbolically, but the answer did check out. I wasn't cheating. And that's like part of when I was like, okay, cool, so I'm going to go for pure math because this applied math horseshit wants me to show work in a way that's not the way my brain works, even though I get the right answer. So I can always just write a fucking Python program to solve ODEs for me, and I'll be fine.
This whole thing though I'm thinking about how calculus was invented twice, so it feels to some people like there may be real hyper objects that we are discovering, and there's some tangible realness like this. But then going back to that interfacing with the Tao, or interfacing on that edge of uncertainty, being able to channel new things, but that when you try to create systems that are about uncertainty, that you're kind of creating certainty about uncertainty, and that it seems to resist giving it gifts. Like the more I try to define whatever it's like there's an element within me from which I channel novelty and beauty and art and stuff, some constructor. And the more I allow it to be not known what it is and not certain, I have principles for how I interrelate with the world and myself. But the more I try not to control it, and the more I allow myself to get out of the way, then the more I sort of flow and channel through signal. And that's very kinesthetic. It's not very like I'm thinking about it, planning. It's all flow. There is no, lines dividing in the brain in those moments. There's micro decisions, of course, but it's a much more integrated, flowing experience. And I love that. And to get there, it's like embracing, I mean, you said it very pretty with the Shakespeare thing. But it's definitely like that. And so it's like, oh, I've learned that I would love people to have a better relationship with uncertainty because it affords a capacity to transform your life path in a way that zooms a little bit more outside of the way that people say your life path should be defined. But as soon as you try to set in some certainty about it, it won't give its gifts because you're saying, oh, this is how you are. This is what it is. It's like trying to say that it goes back to the nameless Tao thing.
Yeah. I mean, so part of what we're talking about here is related to the thing that Buddhists are talking about when they talk about awakening, right? And so specifically what I mean by this is like one way that I might try to language what Buddhists are talking about when they talk about awakening is that you and I have some shared frames right now where like we both can talk about the ways in which we have a thing going on mainly but not entirely in our brains, which is, correlating mutual information between like, memories stored as symbols in the cortex and the hippocampus and, the activations that are resulting from sensory neurons, blah, 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 right? Like, okay, so cool. So like there's a thing that's happening in experience. And like we are, among other things, the way that we experience this is that we tell ourselves a story about like what kind of person we are, about like specific attributes that we have as a person and specific attributes that other people have and specific attributes that the world has, such that like we're creating in essence a sort of narrative arc for ourselves, right? Or more specifically, we're creating a narrative arc for the avatar of ourself that we relate to as ourself within the sort of phenomenological self model generated in the brain, right? Okay, so we're doing that.
Topological flow structures through which we create an identity. Yeah.
Right. So the thing is, though, there is I would argue, basically right relationship and basically wrong relationship with the fact that we are doing that. The basically wrong relationship is to identify with that narrative as the self, such that receiving data and integrating that data that causes a sort of break in the narrative, that causes the narrative to no longer follow the expected narrative arc, is related to as if it were the death of the organism, like the organism which is generating our experience, right? Yeah. And so this opens one up to, among other things, all different kinds of social manipulation strategies and, self-created kinds of misery and, anxiety, neurosis, et cetera, and, all these bad things, right? On the other hand, if we relate to this process as, yes, there is going to emerge a story about a narrative arc that I'm in, but I can pretty cleanly distinguish between, something happens that breaks that narrative arc that is in fact a threat to the organism versus that is not a threat to the organism and is only a threat to the story the organism was telling itself about itself, right? Then you remove from the drivers of your actions basically an entire category of essentially mistakenly perceived threats, like perceptions of threats that don't actually exist, right? Because like, why the fuck are we generating a self model and a narrative and so on, if not for, survival and inclusive fitness purposes by the organism, right? The organism is the thing that matters in a certain sense. And so there's like a weird like takeover where like this relates to like maybe Ian McGilchrist type stuff, master and his emissary, where instead we're relating to the emissary as the self rather than the master or something like that, like we're relating to this story we tell ourselves about ourselves as the real self, instead of relating to the organism which is containing and generating the apparatus to even tell stories as the real self, right? And so one way to cash out what the Buddhists are talking about when they talk about awakening is correcting that misperception, basically correcting the attachment to the contents of the self narrative as self rather than the generator of the self narrative as self.
Okay, so I want to touch on a couple of things. First is that I've been experiencing like a lot of non-dualness lately, and I did in 2017, and I think there's a lot of different flavors of it that are not exactly the same, and we kind of roll like enlightenment or awakening into this or non-dual often into one experience when it's actually very complex and varied. But I wanted to, from the context of this uncertainty versus certainty thing and how we're related.
Well, wait, real quick. Let me jump in and just add something to what you said, because I think you might have misunderstood something I said. I am, to be clear, very much not talking about what people might refer to as enlightenment experiences. Right? I'm very much not referring to subjective states which people call non-dual or awakened or enlightened. I'm referring to the sort of thing that someone like Daniel Ingram might talk about when he talks about there being a transformation that is like you do it and then you're done, and you may occupy a whole host of different kinds of subjective states both before and after, but there's been a sort of fundamental shift in the sort of way of relating to self that is completely enduring.
Is that possible if you have to go to sleep every night?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So like, but what's the transition? Like, okay, so you're not in it while you sleep for sure. So is it like in the morning, the second you open your eyes, you're in this new state? Or is it like, can there be like 5 minutes of
honestly, I think in a lot of ways, most people's relationship to sleep, especially REM sleep, is in some sense more awakened than their relationship to their waking lives on the metric that I was just discussing. What I mean is that most people, and I know a few people who seem to have problems with this, but most people don't have a problem relating to their experiences while they are dreaming as just stories that their mind is telling and not taking them too seriously and getting all butthurt about them, right? So like what I'm talking about is in fact the way that most people relate to their dreams, taking that and relating to all of your experience, which is generated by the same apparatus that generates your dreams, as like that, and therefore not to be taken so seriously.
So with exactly this frame, I'd like to go into the discussion of 5-MeO-DMT and the way that you were discussing that, whatever that state was, that it was extremely far out, because I remember feeling like you were talking about it with such a sense of certainty that was confusing from this particular frame.
Okay, so Buddhist psychology has a lot of theories, some of which I endorse, some of which I partially endorse, some of which I think are essentially bullshit. One of the theories that Buddhist psychology has is that there is something called Taṇhā, which is like part of the mechanism of being not awakened, and which is the source of, if not all, then at least a very large proportion of the sorts of things that we might relate to as neurosis or psychological problems or dukkha or feeling unsatisfied with oneself and one's life. Okay, so are you familiar with the word Taṇhā?
Yeah.
So Taṇhā in Pali essentially means grasping, right? Like the tendency to grasp. Pali is not quite as clear as most Indo-European languages in distinguishing between nouns and verbs. So you could call it like grasping, graspiness, grasped, whatever, right? Like the act of grasping, something in that neighborhood, right? And it comes from the same Proto-Indo-European root as attention and tendon, right? And so all of these to me seem to have a connotation of like tension, of a contraction, of like a focusing, right? So, when we talk about irises, the way that like the muscles, the sphincter muscle of the iris like clenches in order to focus on a thing, right? And so when we talk about somebody being nearsighted, for example, what's happened is that they're like people who are myopic, like myself, and have to wear glasses, have muscles in their eyes which are stuck contracting. We can't fully relax some of the muscles that are used to focus our eyes on a physiological level because of a stuck pattern of tension, right? And so I'm asserting that the thing the Buddhists call being unawakened, being not enlightened, being having Taṇhā as the fundamental driver of your experience, such that you're stuck in dukkha or whatever, is or in samsara, is basically the sort of like metaphorical equivalent of being nearsighted in this particular way, and that there is a stuck pattern of tension that you are identifying with as yourself. But in fact, being tense or not tense there is one of the degrees of freedom available to selves. And so we have misidentified our self as defined as being a thing that is always tense in this particular way, always clenched in this particular way. And so when I talk about 5-MeO-DMT, something that I have a fair amount of intersubjective confirmation from, like people have generated this insight when they've done 5-MeO-DMT, both when I was present and when I was absent, and spoken about it to me spontaneously, both when I was present when they did the 5-MeO-DMT and when I was absent when they did the 5-MeO-DMT, to describe it as causing in them experience which illustrates the degree to which they hadn't realized the specific extent of how much they were just clenching with their mind by default. Like, oh, I thought I knew what it meant to relax grasping or clenching. And now that I've had this experience, I realize there's whole levels of like mental relaxing of tension that I didn't even know could be possible, because I was defining myself as a thing that was sort of a base layer of tension. And now I'm realizing like, oh, wait, I just had that experience. I can still have experience and be myself and let go in certain ways that I didn't even realize were affordances.
Yeah, you're talking about this very clearly now. I feel like I want to go back and rewatch what you said about it for that was very, very
what context, like who was I talking to? What is the thing that you're talking about here?
It was just we were just talking about it. But at the time,
it was a conversation with you and me. Okay.
Yeah. At the time, I didn't have, I mean, like I said, the iris has really allowed me to pull in concepts a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, it's a lot, I didn't have as well of a developed understanding of everything. So there might have been some.
Well, I'm also like
but to me, what that really feels like is almost like the way we talk about freaking like electrons emerging from like an electromagnetic field as being a part of within that space. And then it feels like it's almost like you're talking about consciousness being a field and our perception forming, particles in it as a metaphor.
Right. I don't hold myself to a standard whereby the words that I use to express myself are coherent with each other across multiple interactions. I hold myself to a standard where the underlying structures that I'm using as models of reality that are generating those words as part of an attempt to communicate those models to other minds are consistent, or I make a note of when I've changed my mind about something and I'm now speaking in a way that's inconsistent with my old way of looking at things, right? So this causes some issues for me with people who are doing a sort of consistency tracking where they are reifying the reality of words in a particular way that I don't think words are real. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like they're sort of demanding that I exist within a single semantic map, which has a single like Lacanian Master-Signifier or whatever, right? And I just don't do that. So like on the other hand, I do have a pretty consistent way of looking at things and set of models that I'm trying to communicate to people. And so I'll sometimes need to come at the thing I'm trying to communicate from a variety of different angles, which could be viewed by people who are doing the Master-Signifier thing as coming from different ontologies with different Master-Signifiers. But since I don't do the Master-Signifier thing, it's hard for me to like understand or care about or respond to that sort of criticism, if that makes sense. Like it's funny, I was having a chat on Signal earlier today with someone who had been watching my Stoa stuff and was like essentially approaching me in a way that was like trying to catch me out on like seeming minor inconsistencies between what I'd said in one session or another, or what I said in one session and like what one of my sources said or whatever. And I'm like, I don't think what you're doing is actually sense making so much as trying to catch someone in a gotcha that only is a gotcha if you have a master signifier and are being dominated by Lacan symbolic order or whatever.
This all really deeply connects with my understanding of the world and how I was thinking in the design of cognicism with the iris as being this intersubjective translator. I'd like to inject like a metaphor that I've been showing people recently, which is that like I don't think it's really possible to solve something like Israel and Palestine via meetings or via like representatives of the community speaking for the rest of the people. And I was thinking, I was talking about the idea of an iris as a semantic bridge. And I was saying, if you could take theoretically for like 30 years and create a shared latent space that was capturing people's perceptions of truth and have that latent space try to learn to form outputs that made sense to both people in the shared context, that gradually could create a shared bridge of understanding by creating representations of language formed from the space between. And I think that's a really sort of powerful new frame. And I really strongly agree with your interpretation of language as it exists now, and that my life has been built with frustrations with people's certainty about what they think I meant. That's where a lot of the cognicism came from.
Right.
People saying like, I know what you meant. I'm like, I just told you that you misinterpreted me. Why are you insisting?
Right. So like if I say something and somebody reacts as though I meant something that I didn't mean, and then I say, oh no, so I think you misinterpreted me. Here's another way of saying the thing that I was trying to say. And they're like, no, I know what you meant. Then like that to me is a fairly central example of the thing that I would call interacting in bad faith on their part, basically, right? Like good faith and bad faith, what does this mean? Well, like that's what bad faith means, right? And it's not necessarily their fault. They're not necessarily terrible people for doing it. We all, I would imagine, sometimes do that when we're triggered or whatever. But like, but I do think it's important to be clear about this, that like that sort of phenomenology is like one of the most central examples of discourse in bad faith that I can think of. Because otherwise it's like, okay, so somebody said something and you kind of had a reaction to it and they're like, oh, no, that's not what I was trying to communicate. What if we take this other angle on looking at a different facet of the same thing? Yeah, that's the thing I'm pointing out. Usually like in a good faith interaction, the response is like, oh, okay, sorry, I misinterpreted you. Let's move on, right? And that's like an example of good faith interaction, right? And I do think that this is something that is like actually pretty obvious and apparent to most people. It doesn't require a ton of training. Like kids are really good at picking up on when someone's acting in good faith versus bad faith in this sort of way, both when that person is interacting with them, like with the kid directly. Also, when a kid is observing two adults interacting, the kid can usually pick up on who's being a dick, basically, even if they don't know what half the words mean that the people are using, because this stuff is signaled not just through the linguistic word choices, but also through posture, body language, moving around in 3D space, pupil dilation, blah, 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 blah. And so it's like not usually ambiguous which one is going on. But I'd say like a huge part of the sorts of things that cause the kind of political issues we're concerned with, like say Israel and Palestine as an example, is like people ignoring the evidence of their senses about who's acting in good faith and bad faith, both within their own political coalition and in opposing political coalitions, and allowing people who are acting in bad faith to maintain a sort of implausible simulacrum of plausible deniability with respect to whether they're acting in good or bad faith.
I think that there is certainly, not certainly, not certainly. It's so strange. A lot of people come at my work from this assuming that I'm coming from a lens of certainty or truth.
Right.
And it's like when I first got the download about like prediction as a signal worth paying attention to, and that being like, well, what if I just wrote it down? It did come through a lens of certainty, but it was like a multi-year download to get the full picture of what I felt was coming through. When the idea first came through, it felt like a seed. It felt alive for sure. Like the idea came into my mind simply as if you track predictions, and this is probably like the simplest form of what it could be to come through, because the limited size of my conscious lens was just, if you write down your predictions, you can show to people that you predicted things before or like after like having it. You can just show people like,
right,
you are saying to yourself that you predict things good, and it's frustrating that 3 years later that people are like, or that they ignore you when you say it, and then 3 years later there's a big company, for example, who has made millions and millions of dollars. Now you're like, well, we can't do it because you didn't listen to me, right? Yeah. If you just write that down, then show that to people, that's an interesting and powerful signal. But it was alive, man. And it was just like, this is the core, and I want to connect to everything. And I remember thinking like, I can't think about this right away because it might connect to the wrong things. I don't know how to explain it. I was like, it wants everything.
Oh my God. So there's a really fun thing that's like, I almost want to tell as a joke, but just like, there's a sort of humorous aspect to what I'm about to say, but I think it's exactly what you're talking about in some sense. So like certainty, right? As it has been almost like like the dynamic that you're talking about of like their certainty as a word has been a victim of that dynamic over time. Like what I mean by this is certainty derives from Latin certus, right? Which derives from Latin cerno, right? Which is to discern, basically, right? And discernment also like so that comes from like like it's cognate to, and in some sense comes from Greek krino, right? Which is basically these are all derived from a like Proto-Indo-European root, like kind of a KRNY kind of like kryn kind of root, which means to sieve, as in like to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? Like discernment comes from this, right? And so like certainty actually refers to the output of a process that is sieving things, that is separating out wheat from chaff from the mind stream, basically, right? And so like certainty refers to the present output of a sieving process, not to something that is like inherently and absolutely certain, right? It's like a much more interactive and dynamic thing in terms of its etymology. But now in our current language, people tend to use it in a way to mean like fixed and delivered, wrapped up in a package to you by God or whatever your equivalent is, or like by math, right?
Scientific dogma, like whatever is TM truth.
Right. And it's like, so it's funny because the thing that we're complaining about people doing here, they seem to have done before we were born to the word certainty itself. Right.
We built a culture around, I think Daniel calls it hoarding optionality through the acquisition of resources. That the idea is that you can pile up money, and that means that in the future you have some level of certainty about your existence. And
that itself seems like a slight misunderstanding of what piling up money is, but I could either say why, or you could go out either way.
Well, are you saying if they don't plan to be able to use it, or what do you mean?
No. What I'm saying is, so money doesn't represent optionality. It represents claims on other people's time, basically.
That too.
No, just that actually is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I had a lot of money, and like I really dramatically minimized. I mean, yes. That can be fully resonant. That claim can be fully resonant.
Like what I'm saying is basically that like I'm not saying that this is the only way that one who has money can deploy money. What I'm saying is, insofar as money is a representation of something, right? And that thing that it's representing, like, and David Graeber talks about this in Debt, the First 5,000 Years, how debt comes before money and money emerges from debt rather than the other way around, right? Such that basically money is an accounting system for tracking debts of a certain type. What type of debts? Well, essentially, like if I owe you money, then that's a representation of the fact that I owe you me doing something with my time that I wouldn't otherwise choose to do out of self-interest that helps you, right?
This is deeply embedded with my understanding of it as well. I would say that, like, that's true, but the frame of the optionality is also useful.
I feel like it's gaslighting, honestly. It's gaslighting to me. I feel like it is gaslighting. Like, I feel like framing money as a store of optionality is gaslighting. It's obscurantism. It's obscuring the fact that the sort of optionality it's embedding is the optionality to cause people to do stuff that is against their interest and in your interest, right?
And I get that. And like,
whereas let me just say one more thing before you respond. What I'm saying is that like I would describe the fruits of meditation practice as storing optionality in a much cleaner and purer way than money, right? If that makes sense, right? Because that is a sort of kind of it gives you more optionality in a way that is not making claims on other people's optionality. It's not a zero sumness of optionality like money in some sense can be. It is I am generating more optionality in myself that I can bank and then use in the future.
Yes. I would say that the reason why I disagree is because, I quit my job and I had these 5 years, and there was a portion of my budget that was allocated to paying people that I was collaborating with. The bassist, my friend who had a studio, the producer to help. And we were all friends too, and we wanted to, but there was very much like, and has always been very much in my mind, what you're saying about what money is. But the bulk of what the money did for me was give me the space of freedom to do things on my own. I had 4 years where instead of having to like pay somebody to make a music video, like I had the freedom to learn to make River Island as a music video. I had the freedom to make Clementine as a music video. I had the freedom to make Far From the Shore, which is CG, as a music video. I had all of these freedoms from the fact that I could just live in an apartment and get food, and that was fine, and I could just focus on my work. There is definitely, I think, if we were to talk about what money is, it is probably better to go from the frame of what you were saying.
Well, can I be kind of blunt in a response here? It seems like you are confusing, in the quite literal sense of confuse, fusing together, mixing together, your own quite good way of relating to other people with what money is. Because what I mean by this is like, so from a perspective that is someone observing you, not the perspective that is you, say like my perspective, where I'm essentially trusting and taking seriously your self-reports about how your life has unfolded. It still looks to me like, well, in order to be able to do that, you had to first do a bunch of shit that was not really in your own interest, that you wouldn't have otherwise wanted to do in order to get the money, right?
Yes.
So you were able to accumulate that, but it was sort of zero sum in the sense that you had to give up an enormous number of hours of your life doing shit that wasn't inherently in your own interest in order to have the space where you could then like spend those claims that you had on other people's interest to get them to do shit that wasn't necessarily in their interest, in terms of the people who like grew your food or whatever. And also, and also you were doing a thing where you were taking a fairly like, enlightened or like positive sum way of relating to the money that you had. And you were trying to use it in a way that wasn't like with your friends and your collaborators, you weren't trying to like compel them into doing something against their own interests. You were trying to enable them to do something that was in all of your interests, right? But so
I think was really important though, because when I paused and I said I could fully fit what you're saying to be 100%, like really, really, really resonant, it was because of that. Because even though I was just buying the food, there was this chain within the system of that.
Right.
And I just, I did this birthday show and like my whole talk is about exactly what you're saying. Right. I guess the reason why I think it's useful is I just think that regular people think that way. It's like, why does, my dad obsessed with like, it's because he's afraid of uncertainty and because it creates a sense of certainty. There's a whole lot of negative psychic fucked up stuff that comes along with that. But when I speak to older people who are embedded within the system, they discuss wanting to save it in this way of that they won't have to think about it in the future.
Right.
That's from that frame that I'm saying optionality.
Right. But I'm saying
I can acknowledge that maybe it's not a helpful frame.
Well, it's fine to bring into the conversation because it lets me say the thing I'm about to say, which is that people in that perspective, like people coming from that perspective, are going for exactly like you said. They don't want to have to think about things. They don't want to have to be a mind in some important sense, right? And so this is, I would describe this as the psychic damage that happens to dominators in a domination and submission hierarchy. It's just as bad, if not worse, than the damage that happens to the slave cat class, right? And that like they have ended up in a psychological place where they're relating to resources as resources are the things that enabled me to not have to be conscious, to not have to think, to not have to plan and perceive in the manner of minds. I can pay other people to do that shit for me, to be my servants or slaves, right? And so like this is not to say that any of these are particularly bad people all along like conventional moral axes. What I'm saying is that this is the thing I'm talking about in the Bridge series as like these people are embedded in a social system which is organized along principles of a demonic egregore or an intersubjective parasite, right? Where like, where is the excess consciousness going? Like, so they want to be less conscious. What is getting that like free energy instead is the intersubjective parasite, right? That is the social mode of organization that they're embedded in, that they didn't choose to be embedded in. It's not their fault, right? We shouldn't hate them for it, but we should be able to notice the fact that like they're advocating for the perpetuation of a system that leads even the rich people to not have minds, and that seems bad.
So can I reframe to say that the claim is not like an absolute statement, but rather what I say is the harmful frame about what it is, about what money is, and that what I'm trying to not get us to interrelate with? Like, yeah.
Yeah, like but
So
I
I
guess
love
what I'm saying
talking to you,
is like
man,
when
because with other people, it's like we're really trying to understand each other.
Mhm.
With other people, it's not like that.
Yeah, it's really fucking rare. Like I tweeted about this. I rarely tweet, but I tweeted about this like early Sunday morning, I think, right? I quote tweeted Eigenrobots talking about nobody's trying to win anymore. They're already positioning for advantage and placing blame for the loss. And
Oh yeah,
that's a quote from him. And I said, is the regime we've lived in as long as I've been alive. I read history as evidence that this wasn't always the case and therefore doesn't always have to be. So I say, so the question is who or what is winning? What are the niches in the ecosystem and the nature of their occupants? Individual humans seem not to be the most relevant level of analysis in terms of optimizers occupying niches. We probably want to figure out what is and create intersubjective understanding about the nature of the trade-offs we embody when participating in the available macroorganismic forms. It's not clear to me that many of us are relating to our situations in this way, and if I'm making a mistake by doing so, I'd be grateful to anyone who could point out why and how that's a mistake. Ecosystems all seem to embed conflict over access to structured patterns, which can be digested. You could call that negentropy. I'm orienting with an engineering mindset towards these trophic interactions while simultaneously trying to live according to a kind of metis grounded in intersubjectivity. This isn't a solo process, and yet I feel bottlenecked on minds willing to participate in this sort of intersubjectivity. I'm grateful to those I've shared it with. We seem to be the closest thing to the adults in the room that we grew up assuming existed, hoping to meet the rest. So you're definitely one of the very few people I was referring to that I'm grateful for in that last tweet.
But there's a thing about you that allows that to emerge in me. Like I had even yesterday, like a very difficult conflict where I get triggered into myself and I collapse into like protecting my ego. And it was like literally like somebody was like telling me to look in the mirror about me calling Elon a one truther. And I was like, I'm trying to give tools that are latent spaces that are like
right.
Can either be pre-chained with knowledge that's useful for like growing farms or shit, or animal rights or something. They can be pre-trained, or they can just be like, here's a tool for you to explore your own beliefs.
Right.
I am not trying to enforce upon you other than the concept of over time looking back on what you used to thought and just being like, oh, I said that?
Right.
Weird. I should probably think about that. Oh, I remember what I was thinking that way. Wow, I've changed a lot, or whatever it is. Just something.
Yeah, that reminds me. So, like many years ago, probably 15 or 20 years ago at this point, when I had an OkCupid profile, you know, you were supposed to have like some things on there about yourself or whatever. And the thing that I thought was most descriptive of myself is I'm almost always embarrassed by who I was last week when I think about it, and almost never embarrassed by who I am right now. And this seems like some sort of problem that I should think about, which seems to be getting at a similar thing as what you just said, you know?
The farther back I go, the more that is. I'm more and more comfortable, but then I'm like, oh my God, 2007 on Facebook. I'm like, I cannot imagine what Gen Z or Gen Alpha is going to have to reckon with from their young thoughts.
I know. Well, that's like what I'm working on right now is creating, you know, opportunities for them to have educational experiences and interactions across generations that might hopefully help them build the tools that would let them navigate this like insane like you know, aftermath of anti-memetic super weapons kind of information landscape that we seem to be you know, embedded in ways that don't drive them completely insane or make their lives miserable or whatever. So that's a fancy way of saying trying to start a network of sort of unschooling type initiatives or something like that.
This links me the learning unschooling thing, linking back to the sense of uncertainty and creating sort of being the ocean instead of being the islands of interconnection. And that how I'm always trying to induce that. Well, I'll tell you one thing, that of all the techniques that I've learned, it's infinitely harder without THC. I view THC as creating activations that can gradually diminish and like surf waves. It's like not about me staying high at the same level all the time. It's that I raise the level of activation and then it cools into structures. So that's the cure that relates to me to the
That's like the QRI way. Yeah.
neural healing stuff.
Michael has a really interesting theory about THC neurologically that I've come to think of as more likely to be true the more I've like introspected about it and messed with THC while thinking about it and so on. That about specifically about a specific kind of skillful way to use THC that sort of reminds me of what you're talking about, which it's common knowledge that THC sort of like fucks with like short term and medium term memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Michael has a theory that the way he uses THC and the way that you are talking about it and the way that I have learned to use THC is like a skillful way of doing that such that we are more interfacing with like the hippocampal style of memory rather than the cortical style of memory. Because like short-term memory is like mainly implemented in the cortex and then like through sleep and like and spaced repetition and things like that, then like some of the percepts in the cortex and the mutual information between them are like distilled into new symbols that seem to be stored in the connections of the hippocampus, basically, right, in long-term memory. And so like it's interesting that THC doesn't seem to fuck with people's ability to access long-term memory. So like he describes using THC in a skillful way as like kind of going along with the sort of fucking with like the diminution of short-term and medium-term memory capacity and sort of being able to more consciously directly access, read and write the sort of long-term symbolic structures like organized by the hippocampus, which seems like, that seems basically like what's going on if people do it skillfully. And that's very cool,
And the thing is, if you do not, I've personally found that the only times it becomes problematic is when I'm not willing to engage in not being high.
Right.
In addition. And like, sometimes like, it's even like, it feels like suffering to not. And I'm like, but literally the suffering produces more ideation and helps integrate me. So I'm not one of those people who's like, okay, we should be aiming for a relationality that absolutely like eats the concept of suffering completely. I do feel like that I've had experiences from hormesis that have made me stronger. I do know that my perception of suffering is kind of different in that non-dual state. That it's the valence is very, I don't know how to describe the valence. It's like, I know that it's like ketamine, right? Like, there's pain, or this is how people have described it to me. There's pain, but like, you don't really care.
I think in some sense, ketamine is I hear what you're saying and like the ways of languaging it are very similar. My sense with this is that there's something subtly different with ketamine versus with the thing the Buddhists are talking about. Like it's actually, it doesn't feel like it's dissociating from suffering the same way that ketamine is a dissociative, or PCP is a dissociative, or nitrous is a dissociative and causes dissociation from suffering in the body, right? There's a wonderful quote from this guy who I used to help with his Zen stuff, Claude Anshin Thomas, who's a fascinating dude because he was a grunt basically in Vietnam, an army guy, and got severe PTSD from that, and then ended up going to the Omega Institute for a drumming class, right? And like a drum circle type deal. And he rides up on his big ass Harley, and like the people, some of the people I used to work with there, like were back in the day when he was there, as a for this workshop. The first time he rolls up in this gigantic Harley, he sets up his tent on a tent platform, and he's like walking the perimeter, very military style, obviously PTSD inflected. He's like feeling under threat all the time. He's like checking lines of sight and like has a fucking gun with him and all this shit, right? He's like this Harley riding hardcore, like, ex-Vietnam dude or whatever, right? And then he has to deal with the fact that he's there for this like drumming event, but simultaneously Thich Nhat Hanh is there, who is a, wait for it, Vietnamese Buddhist, right? And he gets like insanely fucking triggered by this and like literally like drives off in his motorcycle. He's like, I don't want to be here. And then he's like, wait, I'm being a coward. And he comes back and so ends up screwing up the courage to go interact with Thich Nhat Hanh. and there's some sort of like dharma transmission thing that happens there, and he ends up becoming Thich Nhat Hanh's student and one of his primary students and a teacher in his own right. And so his particular area of practice focus is working with other veterans with PTSD through Buddhist, psychotech, basically, right? And he has a wonderful quote that he said it in a variety of different ways, but I really appreciate his perspective on this, that he defines healing as not curing our pain and suffering, not getting rid of it, not forgetting about it. But he says healing is learning to live in a different relationship with our pain and suffering so that it does not control us, right? And I think that's the real deal thing that we want to be going for in these sorts of circles, right? And that's different from ketamine, because dissociating is sort of temporarily not being in a relationship with our pain and suffering. And what he's talking about is not giving up the pain and suffering, not dissociating from it, not erasing it, but learning to live in a fundamentally qualitatively different sort of relationship with it. And that seems to be like the way to go here,
Yeah. So I couldn't predict up until he said that, like, what your opinion was on suffering, but that also is aligning with how I'm
interesting
thinking of it. Because like I haven't done ketamine to a way that where I can say that it compares to that experience of dissociation from it. It was just somebody described it to me. So yeah. I was saying that for me, this experience is like what you just said.
The way I relate to ketamine and in general other dissociatives like PCP, DXM, nitrous, and so on is that like if I notice that my friends are doing this in a way that is like not just like I went to a party and like at that party I got real fucked up on some stuff and then I like was like went back to my life or whatever, like cool, you're doing it once a month, that doesn't really bother me or whatever, right? But like if I notice a trend over time in people's dissociative use such that I notice this trend, then I devote significantly more, like I check on this person or these people with like significantly increasing frequency over time, because my prediction is that if I don't, they will end up dying by suicide or overdose, not necessarily from the ketamine or nitrous or PCP or whatever itself, but like this is a trend I've noticed in humans, is that like especially smart, caring people who end up using a lot of dissociatives, even in a medical kind of like, oh, you're doing it for depression, whatever. Like, no, I need to track you and make sure that you don't kill yourself, or at least like have a serious conversation where like you claim very explicitly that you want to kill yourself and I need to fuck off or whatever, in which case, fine, it's your life, man, or whatever,
You do seem to be of the belief that your actions can affect the flow of events, which I do as well. I feel like one of the best gifts that I could give a person, just a simple gift, is right before they leave, right before they drive away, I just tell them to drive safe and to think about it. And they're always like, I know. I'm like, yeah, but now it's in your brain.
Exactly.
So you'll think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I have like supernatural powers of control over reality, but I do in fact think that I can make choices, and that those choices like flow into reality and can cause things to happen that wouldn't otherwise have happened, or prevent things from happening that otherwise would have happened. Like that seems like pretty obvious,
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing this V3 of the manifesto, and one of the parts is this social proof of impact, and it's like trying to find correlations between stated actions and what you expect their outcomes to be, and whether those outcomes actually come to be, and whether they're actually experienced as positively valence later. And you kind of have to believe that you can take actions and that your free will can change the world for that to be a foundation. And I had this big conversation with this guy online who's one of those no free willers. I'm of the belief that like when you engage with that frame, it kind of becomes true in a way, and becomes like more just I don't have the language to describe what happens when you believe there is no free will. But definitely, like I went on this like 10-page thing, like being like, it's more complex than just one free will. Obviously, There's not like a central point because we exist across space. It takes time for signals to integrate. But I feel like it makes sense to say they're interacting wills that are summing and dividing, and that your subjective experience is the relationship of those wills. And you are kind of balancing those wills. And you can have like different thoughts come into your mind that disagree with each other. And you kind of like react to them intuitively. And most people just kind of don't even think about it. But like having been a person who was OCD, and having been a person who had to zoom out from their thoughts as being like, this is not my identity. This is just a messenger and it will communicate something healthy to me. or not. It's just trying to say something.
So I'm curious, this is reminding me of, are you familiar with David Deutsch's research program, trying to figure out where probability comes from in Everettian quantum mechanics?
No, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Okay, so there's a paper by David Wallace, Quantum Probability and Decision Theory Revisited, which is a good place to start with this. But at any rate, the interesting result of this research program is that, so like you have, like in quantum mechanics, you have this thing like probability, right? Like quantum mechanical interactions are probabilistic, right? And we sort of want to be like, but wait, where does probability come from? Like, what is creating the sort of logical uncertainty that shows up in these equations as like probabilities rather than determinism, right? And like there's a lot of quantum woo out there that has perspectives about this, but like is unable to justify them in terms of the math, right? Like
Yes.
when you look at quantum woo, it tends to break down when you get to, you know, like predictions like, oh, so therefore the secret, therefore law of attraction, and some like very you know, like uncomplicated and sort of like Vedic thought in drag kind of way, right? You know. And so the interesting thing though is that it sort of looks like you can do a sort of critical agent-centric, you know, account of the way that things unfold, such that you get the uncertainties you need, you get the probabilities in, you know, quantum mechanical equations emerging from decision theory, specifically from multi-agent decision theory. So, what like the less fancy way of saying this is that the uncertainties in quantum mechanics show up because we're in a universe where choice is you know, not something that is epiphenomenal to physics, but where choice is a part of physics. And so the uncertainties in quantum mechanics show up as because there are minds making decisions in the universe, basically, right? And these minds often make different decisions, and these decisions end up like creating interference patterns with each other, such that that's where the sort of like quantum you know, uncertainty comes from. And there's like David Deutsch has this whole research program about this, and that David Wallace paper is like a good place to start looking at it. It's fascinating.
This is reminding me of like deep in 2008, way back forums. I just read this post that was like somebody, I'm assuming, cosplaying as somebody from the future, saying like, you guys won't discover this yet, but what you actually are causons. It was just like a word they had said. And it took root in my head, and every time something related to what you just described would like happen, my brain would go right back to that word that was supposedly sent from the future.
Yeah.
Which is fun because when we talk about this whole causality thing, I have this new song. It's about that John Ash is like a person or being from 2491. I don't know if it's a multiversal future or if it's like one linear thing. It's not explained in the song, but that being is sending a back message that it's basically like John Ash is a golden god of one, only needs one follower, and he my favorite son. And just like, I could take a base amount of energy right into the core of me. I could snort a crust of blind entropy. Look at me. I'm a golden godly entity. 2491. That's the year that I'll be born. Can't you see that I'm the one out of one? So I just thought it would be funny. Well, this is my self-interpretation, is that it would be funny to create a narrative such that if I was successful with cognicism, that you reach 2491, you get people believing that they're sending that message back in time. It becomes very difficult to disprove. And I just thought that was a funny part of like fucking with causality. And I view that as more of like an emergent narrative that is like just helpful for us to reshape landscape, just like how I hear a lot of people talking about how they're getting messages from aliens, but then they'll be like, just kidding, about systems. And I'm like, yeah, it kind of feels like this is an emergent narrative that helps us make sense of why we're all getting similar sorts of things, when actually the real reason is just like computational. When you're exposed to similar sets of information, there are like levels of predictability about the what will be computed by brains in general, because we have such a shared architecture for the most part.
Oh God, this stuff gets very weird very fast, right? You know, I guess what I'm saying is like, one thing that I like about, say, Forrest's work, right, is that it's not clear that you can, have a sensible way of relating to things, at least from the sort of perspective that we have as like, weakly bounded subsets of a thing that seems like a universe.
Yeah.
It's not clear that there is a sensible way to look at things that doesn't involve choice as in some sense axiomatic.
Yeah.
Like Forrest talks about this, the sort of Deutsch program that I was talking about, like, well, what is decision theory if there's no choices to be made, right? Like in order for you to have a decision theory, you have to be able to make decisions, right? So regardless of like how far the implications of that actually go in quantum mechanics or anything else physical for that matter, like we start seeing some sort of cracks in a reductionist paradigm that is attempting to reduce choice to being made out of non-choice components, if that makes sense, right?
Like I get the reduction, but I'm like, here's how I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it as like energies flowing together. Like we know that there's localized activations. We know that in the middle there's this big thing of like synapses that are flowing together. It's only like 2% or something like that, and most of it is the local integration. But it seems to me like almost like if some calculation here and some calculation here is not resonant, and they become integrated into the center, there's some sort of emergent qualia whereby we resolve it through choice. And a lot of people are like, well, I didn't choose the thought processes that caused me to be able to choose the choice, so there is no choice. I'm like, yeah, but the way that you react will actively shape what type of thoughts will you have in the future. This is like a safety mechanism so you don't kill yourself.
Right. Well, it also though, like I didn't choose the past is like a sort of interesting thing to think about in the context of what we were talking about earlier in this conversation about how like there's uncertainty as you get farther away from your experience of the present moment in any direction, right? So like it's not clear how much more you choose the future than you choose the past, but it does seem clear that choice is a thing, if that makes sense, right? So like, there's like I don't know. At this point, I'm just basically like of the position that if people want to be speaking from a frame where they are committed to free will being fake and epiphenomenal, if they are committed to a frame where the right way to interact is with an ontology where free will is a category error, then I'm like, well, I'm not going to like be your enemy, but I also have no real interest in like having a dialogue about this because the sort of canonical arguments against that position are more or less fully satisfying. And, you can go find them when it's the right time for you to do that. But like, I sort of fail to see how this is my problem with people,
Yeah, I've sort of, in that last interaction, I was basically, listen, like, I think this might be adaptive for you. And I don't think it's my right or responsibility to take that from you. But I do think that you have some level of choice in whether you believe choice is real.
Well, like, the Serenity Prayer. So the Serenity Prayer is normally rendered in English as God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like that's sort of a pretty decent low resolution summary of the way I relate to this, even though I'm not a Christian, or whatever. It's like, okay, so there's definitely a thing where like there are some things that basically we don't seem to have choice about, right? So in that sense, the no free will people are like picking up on a thing, a category of things that seems, or a category of processes that seems to like exist, right? Like, so from my perspective, although humanity as a whole sometime in the deep future might be able to like, change the orbit of the Earth around the sun, like I certainly like that is a thing I cannot change that I have to just basically accept from my perspective, right? For like as long as I'm likely to be alive. And then there's also things I definitely can change that sometimes I feel afraid with respect to, right? And so I need some courage to be able to, change the things that I can, that ought to be changed. And, I also need wisdom to know the difference because, the path of the Earth in the solar system and the solar system in the Milky Way is like pretty obviously the sort of thing I can't change. And, my own thoughts are sort of obviously the sort of thing I can change, but there's a whole spectrum in between those of things where it's not actually clear what the right answer is concerning like the degree to which I can exert, choice over them, right? And that's where the wisdom thing comes in. And that is the specific sort of wisdom that is referred to by the Greek word metis, which I named the little cat and which I'm obsessed about and talk about all the time,
Yeah.
like Aristotle called it phronesis, Latin speakers called it prudentia, people often call it prudence, and there's, pretty decent arguments that it is the root of the other virtues or whatever, right? And I tend to like take that perspective that if we're going to do a virtue ethics kind of thing, we should be orienting around like prudence, phronesis, metis as the root virtue.
Have you ever listened to Strange Hymns? It's okay to say.
I have listened to it like as background music, but not as like I sat down and listened to the whole thing and paid attention to only the whole thing all the way through, which is what I would report as having listened to an album,
It's not designed to be an album that is like, I'm telling you all the answers right away. Whereas album 2 is. But I just was doing this. I mean, like the album is a concept album about the nature of certainty and uncertainty and dualities. Like it's a mirror album where the first half has this masculine energy, the second half has this feminine energy, and there's one track in the middle, and it's like in each ring there is sort of like some reflexive aspect between two songs.
Makes sense.
And in it, the heart of it is the rising sun, the patient moon, and the earth replies, as well as the earth reprise, and it just really tracks this sort of like maps beings onto the earth, the moon, the sun, representing this whole conversation. And I did this birthday show, and I've been working on the last day of cutting it together with all the videos to really sort of explain that this album was about what we're talking about, this whole fucking conversation. It may not like immediately seem like it, but when you dig down to things like the River Delta, like a song about many branching pathways of time, like flow with the path of change, like time can't be tamed. There's all of this stuff within it about the relationship between time and knowing our pathways. Like the first song, Rising Sun, is about certainty of vision, and you just like know your path. The sun is just like, I know where I'm going all around, and I want to get rid of the moon. And the moon is all about reflecting before acting, like being able to hold back, I guess, self from acting and letting this pooling and letting continue to pool for more and more and more and more and more, like processing before the action is taken, right? And now if you always pool and you never take action, then nothing ever happens. So it's like at the ends of the album are like taking driven action without considering anything else, almost like not even choice, because it's like you're not even thinking about it. It's all intuition,
right?
Don't read too much into that. And then at the other end being like, I need to take into consideration, I need to reserve, I need to reflect upon it, and almost seeing it as like the sun being like some light of consciousness shining into a dramatic hallway of mirrors, and it's being like this balance between the light and the hallway of mirrors that is ourself, and then trying to integrate both of those, being like these both have value of vision and clarity of vision and drive, but also the ability to tell those thoughts that drive, are you sure about that? That doesn't, I don't, this thought, you're not really resonating with me. And having the capacity to relate to your thoughts that way, rather than fully identifying with every thought.
This is related to a variety of like ancient three centers type models. Like I was discussing this in the Stoa thing, right? Like, because you're essentially talking about the dynamic interplay between logos, thumos, and epithemia, or between, sattva, rajas, and tamas, and the Vedic conception or whatever, right? Head, heart, and moving center, right? Or gut center or whatever, right? And like, that says like that's the thing. Yeah. Is like, those are all, necessary components of being the sort of mind architecture that we are. And one way to look at most people's issues is a problem with one or more of those centers being integrated with the others, or in the frame I was bringing with the intersubjective parasitology thing, basically a parasite that is attached at the linkage between logos and thumos or something like that.
I mean, like a lot of people don't get why I wrote this album. They're like, if you are trying to do this cognicism thing, why aren't you starting a company? I'm like, I don't know how to explain that. Like, we need new myths that change the way that we relate to being certain. And I don't need to go into the world and say, I'm certain that this mechanism of exploring certainty is what everybody needs. Like,
The framing of a company
But
is somewhat problematic. I was talking with a friend the other day about how, like, so we're looking at things like the lab leak hypothesis, right? And then, so the thing seems to be like, okay, so a lot of people are claiming that there's evidence for the lab leak hypothesis. And this seems like basically likely to be true in some sense. But there's almost something you could call like and this is not my term, but I like it, the lab leak hypothesis, right? Like the hypothesis that we could know about the truth of the lab leak hypothesis one way or the other, right? Which seems to depend on claims like somehow a bunch of people were organized in Southeast Asia to like go into many hundreds or thousands of bat habitats and take samples from the bats there and sequence the genomes of those of the viruses contained in those samples, such that we can have a pretty good idea of the like evolutionary speed and evolutionary pathways that end up getting taken in nature by bat coronaviruses or whatever, right? Because like you have to make a claim like that in order to make the further claim then that people supporting the lab leak hypothesis are making about like the furin cleavage site being strong evidence that this was in some sense an artificially selected for or engineered pathogen, right? And so the whole lab leak hypothesis rests on the on the presupposition that in fact it is possible to cause a bunch of people to go out and do that kind of field biology at scale, right? And if you were to like say that it is possible to cause a bunch of people to go and do that kind of field biology at scale while paying them like relatively little in the way that is being claimed here, most Silicon Valley startup type people would be like, no, you couldn't do that for $1 billion. You couldn't do that for $1 trillion. That's just not the way people work, right? Because their ontology of how to get things done is based on the Silicon Valley startup conception of what having a company means, right? And that's their sort of central mode of relating to what is possible with respect to groups of humans self-organizing and getting things done at scale. And it is absolutely true that it doesn't matter how much VC you raised. And even if you didn't have to turn a profit forever, if you were a Silicon Valley founder, you could not create an edifice of field biologists that would go out and do the data sampling and collection and analysis required to confirm or disconfirm the lab leak hypothesis. But these people don't know about the culture and the organizational modes used by like actual field biologists, of whom I happen to know several, right? And the way they relate to organizing each other and organizing their actions and making decisions is in some sense quite alien to the way that like the Silicon Valley types that I know relate to those things, right? And so there's an almost like not unbridgeable, but there's a very great distance in terms of like the ontology of human social interaction being used by company founders in the Valley, in the Bay Area, compared to like people who make their living as field biologists, right? And it's interesting because I think in this case, the field biologists have a more expansive view because they are aware of the fact that Silicon Valley startups are a thing that can do certain categories of stuff and that that's possible. Whereas the Silicon Valley people essentially assume that if it can't be done by a startup, it can't be done at all, which is, I think, a false assumption.
What is the structure of the Wuhan Research Institute that you think enables them to do it that the company organization isn't?
I'm not making a claim about the organizational structure of the Wuhan Research Institute. I'm making a claim about the sort of culture that field biologists belong to.
Yeah.
Like this, or you could call it a subculture, or you could call it like a cultural clade or something like that. What I'm saying is that I do in fact know a number of people who almost every day go tromp around like the fucking bogs and swamps collecting different kinds of amphibians and like then bringing those samples and running various sorts of analyses on them and then publishing the result, both their raw data and the results of their analyses into like a scientific common knowledge kind of thing, right? And like basically Silicon Valley people would claim that creating a culture like that is impossible, but it can't be impossible because that culture exists.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to bring into that particular discussion. I think the way that I think about the Wuhan big thing is through that sort of, how can I know? I mean, it doesn't surprise me like that there could be people who are constantly doing this stuff, but the actual, I guess the point of evidence that you mentioned, the point or whatever,
mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't really think that it can be known how exactly it happened. We know that there were certain aspects of the physical location. There was a research institute. There were also bats there. I think this just makes me think a lot about like our last conversation about conflict versus mistake theory.
Right. Well,
Ultimately,
this is essentially what I'm saying. I'm not trying to get stuck on the object level question of whether or not the lab leak happened. I'm trying to focus on the meta level question of, so we have people who are claiming that it was a lab leak. And I think honestly, those people are right. If I had to bet on it, I would bet that those people are right. That the thing we perceive as, you know, COVID-19 spreading through the world was not an entirely naturally evolved virus that sprung from an animal reservoir at a wet market, that it was, you know, in some sense, most likely accidentally released from something like the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and was created through gain of function research, which we have extensive documentation was happening there or whatever, right? But again, to not get stuck on the object level question, the meta level question is, how would we know if that were true or not? And the people who are claiming that the lab leak hypothesis is true are using evidence that says that we did all of this data collection, where we went and got all these bats and did analyses on them, right? And what I'm saying is that from the Silicon Valley mindset, they would reject that. They would reject the idea that it is possible to cause that many people to go out into nature and to do that sort of activity and to accurately and truthfully report the results of that activity. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, this gets back to a conversation I was having with Pekowski about, or actually, I think it's just a post and he responded to about like what we call scientific evidence, because the Da Vinci, which is the OpenAI's GPT-3, this one, when I ask a question, it does like to say things like there is no scientific evidence for.
Mm-hmm.
And my frame with that is like, well, what does that mean? That means that you're trying to say there's a true science and a false science, but like true science has lots of replicability issues. So you can't really say that there's no scientific evidence. There is. It's just that it hasn't been integrated into the hierarchical structure of assessment such that they can say it's true or false evidence. But that's just...
Well, we've got to think about, what do we even mean by scientific evidence as opposed to just evidence or Bayesian evidence, right? You know,
Yes.
Because like what I think people are claiming when they say there's no scientific evidence is that people who are members of the cartel of science have not endorsed this data as valid evidence, right?
Yeah.
Because like science, capital S science, as in believe science TM, is telling us that we should defer our sense making to a cartel, in which supply of sense makers is artificially restricted to people who've been through a hazing ritual we call getting a PhD, right? When we look at it like that, it becomes sort of ridiculous to care about whether something is scientific evidence or not. And we should probably just be, you know, like boundedly rational reasoners, like updating on Bayesian evidence and like trying our best to figure out whether the evidence is strong or weak and how much it should, you know, shift our posterior or whatever, right? But this whole idea of there being a really principled way to distinguish between like anecdotes and data and scientific evidence, to me seems like it is a relic of a time in which science was much less of a cartel. You know, like when you look at like the Royal Society, you look at like Newton and Hooke and Boyle and company, right? Like these were not universally people who were endorsed by the university institutional power structure as capital S scientists. Science didn't exist yet. They were, yeah, sure, some professors at Oxford and Cambridge, and some like watchmakers and, you know, random people who like were priests, and some random people who were politicians, and some like aristocrats who just thought this was cool as fuck and wanted to be a part of it. And like they were just like tromping around the fucking world collecting shit and like looking at it and poking at it to see how it worked, right? And you know, we get something like science emerging from that social milieu, right? And then, you know, sometime between then and now, science changed subtly what it refers to. It refers to the outputs of an organizational industrial process, which is managed by universities and the government, right?
Yeah.
And in which it is, for example, illegal to claim to be a professional engineer if you haven't like kowtowed and gone through the hazing rituals of the cartel, even if you can build shit that stays together longer than the guys who have, or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. I think this is where science gets really tied into this notion of language and certainty. And when you look at jargon associated with science, there is like so much complexity built upon complexity and each subfield is creating their own like language set, and often that language set doesn't really fully align with some other subfield,
right?
And people try to be like, oh, there's really no central organizing principle. There's all of these disparate sets of language, but then we try to create this hierarchical structure where we're like, starts with like physics or math at the bottom, we build, and that these symbols are real. But I say, like, if you had like a latent space that was representing all of science, and like you took away all of the language, and then you took those agents and you re-exposed them to the same environment, something new would emerge from that, but it definitely would have dramatically different structure, even though it's sort of modeling the same way things in different language. And I think that we have to find ways, or it would help if that could happen to the whole scientific field in a way where there could be some reintegration of, wow, there's so many diverse fields, and none of these people can even talk to each other, or no single mind can hold all of this. I think there needs to be an integration of all of these different forms beyond the skills that we as individuals have. I mean, the peer review process is like,
yeah, I mean, I basically agree with all that, though I think it is a very mistake theory-ish lens on what's happened with science. And I think I think I take a much more like conflict theory-ish lens as far as what's happened with science in terms of like how I decide to do things and how I decide to relate to scientific results and to people who claim to be scientists and have PhDs and so on, basically, right?
I think I might actually take a conflict theory-oriented view to science too, actually.
What I'm saying here is basically that like all of that is very mistake theory-ish, and that like, oh, we just like really innocently wanted to explore the world, and like we started with math and physics, and then like we branched out, and like in the course of branching out, like these subdisciplines developed their own languages to be able to communicate amongst each other more efficiently and share results more efficiently. And like so we have this sort of, you know, like Tower of Babel problem with respect to like integrating scientific perspectives. And like I'm not saying that there's none of that that's gone on, right? But also I think that, you know, science with a capital S, like science TM or whatever, you know, like I believe science type thing. Like that itself is a great example of the sort of thing that gives political power an incentive to capture science as a label, basically, right? Well, like what I mean by this is that, so in some sense, the thing that we might call truth could be defined as the degree to which something like, you know, like there's correspondence theories of truth, there's pragmatic theories of truth, there, you know, there's these sort of like principled philosophical ways of, you know, defining truth. But I think as a practical matter, the way that most people actually relate to whether or not something is true is, it basically has approximately two principal components. One is how narratively central is this thing, and two is how endorsed by people is this thing, right? How socially endorsed is it? Like, so for example,
it's true.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, so in some sense, you know, the mainstream edifice of like research universities and NIH grants and, you know, the National Endowment for Science and all this stuff is like the government sticking its fingers into the narrative centrality and endorsement printers and manipulating them, basically, right? Such that, you know, narrative and centrality and endorsement go brrr. So you get the ability of people who have basically conflict and power incentives to spend money in various ways into the university scientific edifice to cause it to produce results which support them politically. Yeah. And this is something we saw with, you know, sugar versus fat. This is something we saw with like, are cigarettes causing cancer? This is something we've seen now with the lab leak theory or COVID origins. Like, and, you know, you can point to dozens and dozens of other examples of how essentially what the sort of thing that like universities are not doing the same sort of thing that the Royal Society of London was doing when Newton was a member of it. They are doing a sort of thing which is LARPing that, but producing results which are in the political interests of their patrons. Like there's very much a client-patron relationship between science and political power going on, which should cause us to, you know, try to develop some method of, you know, error correction, of bias correction, of discounting the central claims of the scientific consensus in areas that have strong political implications, because they are extremely likely to have been influenced and distorted by, you know, political dark money and other forms of projecting political power, basically.
No, I think that's how I view it too. That is strongly resonant. And I think what I was saying more was not that that was my theory about how it is. I guess maybe it's a nice frame to say, like, this is how I think that it could be approached to address it. Like the same thing with the Israel Palestine. It's like you take two different fields like connectomics and like I don't know, like chemistry or something, and create a shared latent space. And over time, you have that sort of interdisciplinary iris to be able to form new representations because they're not going to collaborate otherwise because there doesn't exist a field between those things.
Right. And I
like, could we farm a process which takes this overbearing complexity that exists now and then sort of anneal it down into a simpler structure that is more transversable, as just a sort of thought experiment as how we approach it. But I think that
I think you're right that we in fact can do that, and we've in fact known how to do that in a slower and more human intensive kind of way for quite a long time, right?
Yeah.
Like in some sense that is the story of like scholarship and science until like the relatively modern era, right? Is in fact doing that process you just described. You know, people noticing, oh cool, so there's like chemistry and then there's physics, and then oh wait, they seem to be like abutting each other, and now we can talk about physical chemistry, right? Or there's biology and chemistry, and now we can talk about like biochemistry and organic chemistry and whatever, you know, right? Okay, cool. You know, and so this thing was happening, right? Like the process was less Babel like and more like, okay, like creating these sorts of cognitive irises or lensing things that you're talking about, right, in order to enable better discourse, right? And so something happened. You know, I would place it sort of in the period between, you know, 1890 and 1950 or something like that, that sort of changed the course of things such that we no longer seem to be orienting that way towards science. Scientists no longer seem to be doing that. They seem to be doing an increasingly fragmentary Babel type thing that both makes the results of science harder for normal people to understand and act on, as well as decreases the ability of scientists to communicate across disciplines and create new interdisciplinary fields. And so, you know, I'm saying, well, what changed? Like what factor changed such that we see a different dynamic in play now, that we seem to have ended up in a different attractor than science was in from, say, like, you know, 1660 through like 1800 or 1850 or whatever, right? And, you know, like my basic answer to this is that science, you know, fell into a failure mode that's extremely common for things which are essentially like funded by patronage from the aristocracy, which is to say that they will increasingly adopt aristocratic modes of organization themselves, such that over time they become a, like, you know, third or fourth order Baudrillardian simulacrum of themselves and are essentially just a shell around aristocratic power games and orientation. You know?
So one way I might think about it is like, say I had a theory that connectomics and condensed matter physics were deeply interconnected and that needed to be studied. I think that most people would look at it a frame like, okay, I need to get funding, I need to get research, I need to get money so that I can pay people research attendants to do things for me, to be able to process all of this information, to sort of research this and get this connection. If I was to say in my present life, I wanted to make that connection and I wanted to do it for a minimal amount of my own investment and actually have it have some sort of impact, I would literally just find a collection of people on Twitter from both of those fucking fields, have them go into another iris, create the synthesis, and have it message those fucking people and just like step back and just see what happens, rather than say, I need to make money to create within the system of established science.
Well, and even if you had essentially unlimited money, my claim is that you wouldn't be able to do it in the way where you like hire people and spend money and cause them to do this thing, because they would be people who are coming from within the incentive structure of institutional science and who have their own, you know, perception of their own interests, such that, you know, they would be operating according to that incentive structure. And people here value things that are not money more than money. Like the currency of science is prestige and citations and tenure track positions, not money, right? Such that they would be looking at, how do I leverage my participation in this thing that John Ash is willing to pay me for, to increase my level of prestige, the number of times my papers are cited, the likelihood that I end up on a tenure track position at Harvard or at MIT or whatever, right? In such a way as to distort the incentive structure that you were trying to create by paying them and creating performance incentives based on whatever, right? Because they're not in it for the money, they're in it for the prestige, which is a fundamentally aristocratic way of orienting, is my point.
So that leading to, for example, increased complexity, right? Because you want the prestige, so you need to communicate in a lens that seems complex, right? Is that more conflict or is that more mistake theory? Is that emergent?
Sorry, I missed a thing there. I had a connection hiccup. Can you restate that? So we were talking about the ways in which they would be you would be unable to cause them to create the new interdisciplinary thing that you wanted in the way that you wanted it, even if you had like, $50 billion, because they are conditioned by their participation in an aristocratic patron-client system of, institutional science, basically.
So I was noticing that prestige is a pretty good predictor or explainer of why there would be increased complexity in the writing rather than simplicity is in relationship to that. And then I was like, wait, is that mistake or conflict theory?
Conflict, I think. Like what I mean is that,
because I can view that as just being like an emergent thing too.
Well, I mean, of course it's emergent, but it's emergent from structural incentives. And so what I'm getting at here is that I think that the reason that scientific writing is generally related to by most people as dry and boring and overly complicated and using unnatural sentence structures and uncommon word choices and so on, there is a small component of that, which is that like science needs to be able to define something like energy in a much more like concrete and specific and indexical way than it's used in like common English parlance. And so that's like a tiny bit of it. But I think the main thing is that science is operating in a manner similar to a cartel, which I described earlier, in that like, citizen scientists, right? The phrase, right? Like most of the founders of the Royal Society were citizen scientists rather than professional researchers at an academic institution, right? And so if you look at a lot of the really major discoveries, I mean, even until recently, like what was Einstein doing when he came up with his theories about relativity, right? He was not like lecturing at a university with a PhD. He was, like a patent clerk, right? And doing this because it was interesting to him in his spare time, more or less, right? And so you have a history of major contributions being made to the most central scientific fields by people who were not participants in the like patron client oriented system of, the university system, right? But that's much less the case now than it historically was, right? The things that are considered central, like narratively central, things that everybody needs to know about and talk about in science these days, until very recently, have been almost exclusively for the past 40 or 50 years produced by people who are in fact PhD holding tenure track professors at major research universities or whatever, right? And it like for that to be mistake rather than conflict embeds the assertion that those universities have gotten so good at offering scholarships to the right people and incentivizing the right people such that all of the best minds are located in that system, which is like obviously false. If you go to their parties and talk to them, most of these people are fucking idiots, no offense, like relative to you or the other people that I hang out with that I met randomly on Twitter, right? And so like the quality of the sense making, they're not doing a sieving process where they're separating the wheat from the chaff, and all the best sense makers are in the university official capital S science TM system, right? So something else has to be going on, and that something else I'm asserting is that they've created a cartel where the outputs of this cartel are legitimized science TM, scientism, and everything else is delegitimized by the existence of this cartel. The same way that like Western medicine has a thing they call like real medicine, right? Western medicine. And in order to deliver that kind of care, you have to be a member of a number of interlinked cartels. Like, you have to be a board certified doctor or nurse or physical therapist or, whatever. There is a coordinated set of social moves by this cartel to delegitimize all other forms of healing people from disease and injury, right? They are allergic to forms of healing people from disease and injury in a way that is not able to have value captured and extracted by a cartel-like structure,
You're just crazy because I feel like you're one of the only people who can really understand why I am taking the path that I am, based off of the initial conditions that I'm a guy with a manifesto about something at all. Like, why would a person choose to not start a company? Why would a person resist collaborating with people so strongly and focus so much on just communicating it well? Like, obviously, you need money to build things. You should just build it, right? You should just build it and be the center node of that, right? People have such a hard time understanding that. And I think it's interesting because I feel like a lot of the reasons come from what you came to through conflict theory, right? Like, exact same thing of being like, there is some conflict-oriented reason, and therefore, this is the way I need to relate to the world. And I came from it more like emergent, but came to similar conclusions that resulted in the same decisions of not interpairing myself with a larger structure like that. And
I mean, I would describe this thing as consilience, right? Like
yeah.
like consilience is a thing, and we're coming from very different native perspectives and ontologies, and we're doing the thing where we like in good faith try to learn from the universe and update our models and come up with the best, ways of relating to things that we can. And so of course there are going to be like regularities in the thing that's generating both of our sense data because we live in the same universe. And so there's going to be consilience that occurs even if we're coming from like vastly different places.
Yeah. I mean, we see bats and we see birds, and then it's like, why wouldn't there be convergent evolution of memetics too? Like, right, from similar conditions.
Call it memetic carcinization, right?
Yeah.
I guess we're just the crabs that everything wants to evolve into memetically.
Yeah. No, we're all evolving into just energy sphere, or energy sphere. That's all we're going to be. There's going to be no universe, but just energy ball that just perceives at its singularity, the edge. It's just moving through the universe, continuously consuming information into its. Oh wait, is that a black hole? I don't know.
Well, hey, FYI, I'm gonna have to run soon to go to Kung Fu and do all that. So, any like last, let's say we got 10 minutes or so. Where do you want to go with that?
I mean, I just love talking to you. This is
likewise. Let's do it again, like sooner than the previous interval between our
we always say that, but I'm always so shy, and you're always so brilliant, and like it's like I always want to feel like I've acquired a bunch of new knowledge so that I can like.
But look, like so the way that I'm relating to these sorts of conversations I have with people is not like a beauty pageant where we show off the knowledge we've already acquired, but where we try to like ideally generate something new. And maybe it's not new knowledge, but maybe it's a new way of expressing something that we have, consilient agreement on, that like, if you record this and edit it down or whatever, or if I do, then like can be shared with other people and they can, like tell us whether we're full of shit or not, right? And like kind of, like I'm interested in the possibility of like, is consilient sense making something that can be super critical in the same way that like these sort of parasitic egregoric forms of social organization seem to have been able to be super critical? Like, can we start a chain reaction basically that goes out so that like you and I and the couple other people we know who like to relate in this way don't have to like go personally have conversations with each of the 9 billion or 8 billion or whatever people on the planet. Can we create a supercritical reaction that is self-sustaining, where we don't have to do all of it, basically, right? It is an open question in my mind, but like it is basically the strategy that I'm pursuing now is I'm acting as if that is possible and seeing how it works out.
Yeah.
Hi, Evan.
Hello.
This is my beloved.
Hello.
Howdy.
Is your little cat still in the room?
I think she is. Yeah, let me grab her. She is right here.
I love little cats.
Yeah. It's just.
Oh my gosh, Tao's cousin.
Tao's cousin.
Cute.
This little cat, like, I wasn't looking for a new kitten. I have 2 cats already, and they're like, that seemed like a fine number of cats to have at the house. But this one needed a place to live, and the place she was at didn't work out for her, and so she now lives here.
Oh, sweet pea. She loves you.
Well, she's actually biting my neck right now. She's a very bitey little void. But she is also a lover too. Like she will like, she's in the kitten phase where she like, will like cuddle up and love and like headbutt and like rub her face on you and then like bite you a few times, then go back to like licking and cuddling and so on. She's like not sure how to figure out whether she's in love mode or kill mode, and like that seems to be part of being a kitten. So it's very cute.
Boy kitty.
I mean, the kill seems to be how the two kittens that we have show each other.
Yeah.
Socialization,
Exactly. Yeah.
The two different ends of it. It's funny. I was about to just ask you about like, is like calculus like as a hyperobject real because like different people come to these different real things, this conciliate view of are these things actually real outside of our conciliate perceptions? And then I'm like, oh, your cat is so much more real than any of that bullshit.
Yeah. Also, as far as that question goes, I actually think a good basis for discussing that maybe next time is to look in Forrest's Immanent Metaphysics at his discussion of the distinction between between the meanings of real, actual, and exist.
Yeah.
He has a very cogent discussion of this that I think is a good jumping off point for talking about that, basically.
We keep bringing up Forrest.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about Forrest, when I talk to him and being like, you're like a being of light, is that like and I think he has noticed this in himself, is that he causes cascades of updates through interface with people. And with me, it's kind of just reaffirming things that I already know, but it's still overwhelming to be like, and I'm like, I cannot process this amount of neural flow right now. And so I'm so empathetic to him as a person because I think that's probably hard to exist like that.
Definitely.
But it's such a gift to be able to, give that to somebody if they're ready. It's almost like he's like a walking hallucinogenic. But I need to have another conversation with him where I'm like prepared and grounded and feel ready. Because
have you hung out with him in person? Yeah. I feel like interacting with him is in some sense easier in person than online because like the other information channels that aren't just verbal and auditory seem to like help modulate what he's doing in some sense.
For me in person, it became like a physical entangling, like there's some deeper physics going on like that is beyond, and it's a lot. And it's like, I just at a certain point was like, I just need to allow my brain to finish doing these updates before I get any more.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
I'm grateful that you are such a skilled communicator that and I think you intuitively probably know when to share certain information.
I at least am very consciously like in some sense the skill I've focused on developing the most is like, how do I communicate well with people? Like rather than how do I be as correct as possible about things, or how do I have as much power as possible, or how do I become as happy as possible? Like those are all subtly different things to be like working on as your sort of central skill. For me, I don't claim to be the best ever at it, but it is in fact the case that like how do I communicate well with people is the way that I've oriented since I was like 15 or 16 or something like that, and like quite consciously just tried to work on that. And it seems to be like, well, I seem to have made some progress with that at least, and hopefully we'll continue to do so.
I think that's a good place to put a pin in it because that's why I chose the name speaker. It's like that's
there you
what I'm to learn to do is communicate big complexity as well.
Hell yeah. All right, man. Well, let's do it again soon.
Yeah. Have fun. Have a great day, man.
Will do. I'll talk to you soon.
Later. Bye.